Hi, everyone. My name is Faisal, and I'm from UTS, and I'm working on my PhD. So my project is titled Going Further, Continuing Learning and Education for People with Down Syndrome, aged 16 to 45. I'd like to begin with a quote that has struck me. It comes from a study by Pillay et al. 2012. One of their participants said of her young child with Down syndrome, "He'll never go to university. He'll never father, give me grandchildren. He's unlikely to marry. And it's sad that he'll never have that." Now, for me, as a father of a young child with Down syndrome myself, I confess that those were some of my immediate thoughts when I found out about my son's diagnosis during the pregnancy. And so these ways of thinking about people with Down syndrome are still quite prevalent. And by doing this research, I hope to challenge some of these deficit discourses. Because the reality is that people with Down syndrome can and do participate in further education, both vocational education and university. And that's exactly what we see in the literature as well. So globally, inclusive post-secondary education for people with Down syndrome or intellectual disability more generally is still quite a new field. And this is especially so in Australia, particularly in the university context. We have over 40 universities, but there are only 2 university programs specifically for people with intellectual disability. In these programs, people can experience university life as audit students. Now, although the numbers may be quite few, there are some important research studies, and these studies have shown that people with Down syndrome do wish to participate in post-secondary education, and they can be quite self-determined and self-motivated, and they can and do succeed with the right support, like peer mentoring and supportive teachers and staff. Learners enjoy the independence, the relationships, and the learning that they experience in post-secondary education. And at the same time, it's acknowledged that some aspects of the learning can be difficult, whether it be the content itself or the teaching methods that pose challenges. And finally, parents and carers play a very significant role in actually getting people with Down syndrome into further education. So families might have prior connections that help open up opportunities for vet and university, or sometimes their professional background or financial background facilitate that access. I draw your attention to the story of Rachel High, a 44-year-old Australian. Last year, Rachel actually graduated with a bachelor degree from Flinders University. And Rachel is almost certainly the first person with Down syndrome in Australia to graduate with a university degree. So can people with Down syndrome go to university and vocational education? Well, I think Rachel's story and others like hers give us a pretty compelling answer. And so in the same way, my research tries to put the spotlight on the potential and the achievements of people with Down syndrome. So a little bit about the research before I go into the findings. Now, theoretically, my research aligns with the framework of critical disability studies. Fundamentally, it shapes my understanding of what disability is. Disability is understood to be a multifaceted experience. So Hoskin explains that disability is a complex interrelationship between impairment, individual response to impairment, and the social environment. So the issue of impairment is important, but so are the social and structural issues that people face. And critical disability studies also foregrounds the voices and lived experiences of people with disability. And sadly, sometimes research about disability has actually marginalized or even excluded people with disability themselves. And finally, as with critical theory more generally, human emancipation is one of the overall goals of critical disability studies. It's meant to be a transformative theory. It strives for social change, political change, and economic change. so that people with disability can exercise their rights and also participate more fully in society. And so this is really my overall goal in doing the research as well. I see my project as a form of advocacy. I hope to promote the potential of people with Down syndrome to participate in uni and vocational education. I'd love to see more opportunities open up and to see further education become more inclusive and more accessible for all learners. And I work towards this by exploring research questions like, what hopes and goals do people with Down syndrome have towards further education? What experiences have people had? What are the enablers and barriers to participation? And what things have learners found enjoyable and challenging about further education? So far, I've interviewed 11 people. So that's 5 people with Down syndrome and 6 parents. So 6 different families have taken part. But for this presentation, I'll only be sharing about one particular family. And in terms of my methodology, fundamentally, I've sought to align my research with principles of inclusive research, because we must include people with Down syndrome in research in ways that are sensitive and ethical. So I've applied a few key strategies to try to make my interviews more inclusive and more accessible. Oops. The first is the use of easy read documents. So easy read is a way of presenting information to make things clearer and more accessible. It uses photos and images to support the text. So I designed my information sheet and my interview guide using easy read. As you can see, I used a paid resource called Photo Symbols because their photos are quite familiar to people in the community. And before doing the recruitment, I received some feedback from some stakeholders within the Down syndrome community as well. Inclusive communication strategies have also been important for me during the interviews. So my key practices have been speaking clearly and concisely, allowing time for silence and processing, listening and responding with interest, and sharing my personal experiences when relevant. Now, there were of course some communication challenges along the way, but mostly the parents commented that some good strategies were in place. I also use visual research methods to make the interviews more engaging and inclusive. So participants were invited to share photos to enrich their responses. And I noticed that people with Down syndrome were very much more excited during those particular parts of the interviews. And finally, my background and positionality have also helped me to approach the participants more sensitively. So I myself am part of the broader Down syndrome community because of my 3rd child. And being an insider has helped me to build rapport with the participants. And it's also made the interviews more personal and more open. So of course, there have been many challenges along the way, but these are some of the key strategies that have helped me to navigate the research so far. So with all that in mind, I'd like to just share some of my preliminary findings, and I'll focus on just one family so that their particular voice and their particular lived experiences can be explored in a bit more detail. And their story is quite similar to what we find in the literature. So let me introduce Helen, not her real name nor photo, but Helen is a 22-year-old living with Down syndrome. She lives semi-independently in a granny flat. She likes sport, drama, hanging out with her friends, and perhaps most importantly, she loves her coffee. And that will be important for her story. Her mother, Leanne, is very involved with the Down syndrome community in supporting and advocating for people with Down syndrome. And the family lives in a relatively small city, about 6 hours drive from Sydney. And Helen's journey into and through further education was relatively straightforward. Helen attended a mainstream Catholic high school, which she loved. And importantly, she had vocational experiences in hospitality and food technology in her later years. And these experiences facilitated her entry into further education. Helen said that while I was still in school, I went to TAFE to do a baking course, and that made it easy for me to go to TAFE after I graduated from year 12. And as her mum explained, TAFE was what she wanted. That's what she had in her mind. So with the help of her mum and her friend's mum who worked at TAFE, Helen enrolled in the Certificate 3 in hospitality. At TAFE, Helen learned many practical hospitalities, such as making coffee as a barista. She loved her time at TAFE because of the independence, the friendships, as well as the learning. Interestingly, when I asked Helen, what did you find difficult about further education? She initially said, I didn't find anything hard about it. But Helen's mum reminded her of one thing, and that was using the cash register. That was the one thing Helen failed. But thanks to her persistence and her teacher's support, Helen was successful the second time around. And for Helen, completing a Certificate 3 led to very tangible employment outcomes. Thanks to her love for coffee and her qualification, Helen gained employment as a barista. Interestingly, her workplace is actually a medical center. So Helen was employed to make coffee for the doctors and the staff. And what's even more interesting is that Helen discovered she had other useful work skills. Now, because the medical center has a great inclusive culture, Helen was given other tasks to do on top of her barista job. And they found out that she's also very good at data entry, filling out forms and other administrative tasks. So much so that she's now actually employed as an admin assistant. So for Helen, further education and employment are a journey, a process that can take surprising twists and turns, with one thing leading on to another. Now, the journey doesn't end here. Helen still has other dreams for her life. She'd like to go further and higher still to study nursing and become a nurse. So the family isn't sure whether those hopes will eventuate, but the dreams are definitely there. I'll stay on this point a little bit longer because it really connects with the quote I shared at the beginning about he'll never go to university. So on the issue of going further into university, Helen and her mum shared some slightly different perspectives. For Helen, it was quite simple. When I asked her the question, what plans do you have for further learning? She articulated quite clear and specific goals. She said, I would be happy to go back to TAFE to learn skills for my current job. She explained that she'd like to study nursing at TAFE. And she went further to say that I think it'd be good to study nursing at university. So will Helen ever go to uni? Well, she'd certainly love to, and that is her perspective. Now, it's important to hear Helen's mum's perspective too, because Leanne's response reflects both hope and also uncertainty regarding university education for her daughter. And firstly, Leanne reiterated her daughter's interest towards higher education. She said, oh yes, she would love to. She's already researched. So she knows that if she wanted to be a nurse, she would have to go to uni. So we see Helen's self-determination. Now, as a young adult, she wants to set her own goals and make her own decisions in life. Leanne also explained that she'd be quite comfortable with that whole thing of university here because she's been out there. So Helen's TAFE campus is actually on the same site as a university. So every time she went to TAFE, she was continually exposed to university life. And even this kind of casual contact would make it much easier for her to settle into university if she had the opportunity. So this is the more hopeful aspect of Leanne's perspective. But Leanne also shared about the uncertainty of higher education. And here I'll share with you a longer quote from the interview. She's been through a thing of where she'd really like to be a nurse. And I'm sure she could quite easily pass the TAFE course to be an aged care nurse, but I don't think she could realistically get full nurse's qualifications. So as the mum, Leanne sees more of the bigger picture than Helen does. She sees the barriers to accessing university for people with Down syndrome. She sees the relative lack of inclusive education practices. and the struggles that Helen would face as a university student. Now, at the same time, Leanne doesn't allow Helen to be stuck with what Helen can't have. She explains that, but we give her little things like you're working in a medical center and you're being part of the team that's helping people, especially with COVID. So she's happy with that at the moment. So Leanne emphasizes what her daughter is doing right now. And in fact, Helen is fulfilling some nurse-like duties in her workplace right now. But yes, in terms of the future, there is a lot of uncertainty. But whether that will be something later on that she wants to pursue, and I would let her attempt it to try and see where she could fit in that goal. She's actually just done her first aid course. So now she can be a first aid officer at work and everything. So that makes her feel like she's really helping people. So we kind of let her work towards these goals that she has. So despite the uncertainties, what's clear is that Helen does have hopes and goals for her life, and that higher education and employment are both very, very important for her. She's very self-determined and she's taking concrete steps towards fulfilling those goals. So will she ever go to uni? Well, admittedly, it is a complicated question, but certainly Helen would love to go further and go higher if she were given the opportunity. So I'd like to suggest just a few preliminary implications. The first is to raise awareness that people with Down syndrome can and do participate in further education. So their voices and their lived experiences need to be promoted. Parents and carers need to be well informed. They need to know what opportunities exist and also how to advocate for their family member. And furthermore, it would be great to see an increase in the opportunities for further education. And sometimes people are hindered by what's actually available. And this is really significant because people with Down syndrome tend to access courses that match their interests and their strengths. And finally, it's important to implement more inclusive teaching practices in vet colleges and also in universities. Generally speaking, learners with Down syndrome do have certain strengths and challenges. So educators need to be better equipped to support each individual learner. So in conclusion, people with Down syndrome can and do participate in further education. With the right opportunity and the right support, they can be successful. So thank you so much for coming to my presentation today. And I hope it's increased your vision of what's actually possible for people with Down syndrome in our world today. Thank you.